I had lived in my quiet little neighborhood for almost 10 years. It was the kind of place where neighbors borrowed sugar, dogs roamed the streets without leashes, and everyone knew everyone else's birthdays. Peaceful, predictable, almost boring in the best way. Until the HOA decided we needed enhanced security. That's when Rick arrived. Rick was a tall, broad man who seemed to take his job way too seriously. He carried a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt, sunglasses on even at night, and he had this strange swagger like he'd just stepped out of an action movie. Apparently, patrolling 18 houses could be a dangerous mission, at least in his mind. He installed a tiny guard shack at the entrance, complete with blinking lights and a stack of authority manuals he probably never read. The neighbors started whispering about him almost immediately. One lady swore he glared at her mail like it had committed a crime. At first, I laughed. I thought maybe it would be fun, like having our own suburban secret agent. Rick even gave himself a title, Chief of Operations. He loved saying it in a deep, serious tone like he was announcing a military campaign. I started keeping an eye on him, mostly for entertainment, until the day he picked the wrong target. My daughter Emily was coming home that weekend. She had been working non-stop with the FBI, and this was her first break in months. I was excited to see her, not prepared for the chaos that would follow. I texted her when she got close, "Don't mind the guard, he's harmless, probably." I should have known better. Rick apparently didn't believe in harmless. The moment he saw her vehicle approaching the gate, he straightened up like a soldier spotting a spy. She was driving her usual government-issued SUV, tinted windows, tags clearly visible, nothing suspicious at all, but in Rick's eyes, she was an intruder. He waved his hand aggressively, signaling her to stop. The calm little neighborhood instantly transformed into a checkpoint from a bad action movie. I rushed to the window of my house to watch. Rick stepped out, barking orders as if he were negotiating with a dangerous criminal. "Step out of the vehicle, show me your id," he shouted, pointing at the SUV. Emily rolled down the window slowly, smiling politely. "Hello, sir, I'm here to visit my father, House 42, she said calmly. Rick ignored her words. He shouted louder, repeating his demand like a broken record. I tried yelling from my porch, "Rick, she's my daughter, relax." But he didn't even glance in my direction. He was completely absorbed in his delusion of authority. He fumbled with his belt and, I swear, reached for his sidearm without a second thought. At that moment, something inside me froze. My heart skipped a beat. Rick's whole demeanor screamed confidence, the kind of confidence people have before they realize they're in over their heads. He probably thought he was about to show some suburban rebel who was boss. He had no idea he was about to pick a fight with someone who could disarm him faster than he could blink. My daughter, Emily, was trained in federal tactical operations. She had dealt with armed threats and high-stakes situations thousands of times. But in this neighborhood, it was her first encounter with an overzealous guard with a power trip. She didn't panic. She didn't raise her voice. She simply assessed the situation, her eyes scanning him, the surrounding area, and even the tiny guard shack. She leaned slightly forward in her seat, keeping calm but ready to act. In her world, patience and timing were everything. I could only imagine what she was thinking, but I knew one thing for sure: Rick had no idea what he had just walked into. Rick's walkie-talkie crackled in the silence, his own confidence feeding him like a drug. He was ready to assert control, unaware that his entire sense of authority was about to collapse. I watched, frozen and anxious, as the scene became charged with a tension so thick I could almost taste it in the air. One wrong move and it could escalate. And yet, I knew my daughter would handle it. She always did. At that moment, I realized this wasn't going to be a funny story about a paranoid neighborhood guard. This was about to become something completely different. Something that would leave the entire HOA shaken, and maybe, just maybe, teach them a lesson they would never forget. Hook, he didn't realize who he was messing with, and the weekend had only just begun. The weekend had barely started, and already the neighborhood felt like a ticking time bomb. I kept packing near the window, watching the gate like a nervous hawk. Every time a car rolled by, I wondered if Rick would find another reason to overreact. I could feel my stomach tightening. It wasn't just the tension, it was the anticipation of what was coming. My daughter Emily had been serving in the FBI for years, mostly in tactical operations. She had been deployed on assignments that I wouldn't even want to imagine. She had stared danger in the face more times than I could count, and yet here she was, casually driving her government-issued SUV back into our quiet suburban street. She was coming home on leave, and I had hoped for a calm weekend. I should have known better. As she approached the gate, I could see Rick straighten up immediately. He stepped out of his little guard shack, squinting at her vehicle, acting as if he had spotted a fugitive crossing the neighborhood line. His walkie-talkie crackled, and he barked orders, waving his arms like a traffic director in a hurricane. My daughter slowed down, rolled her window down politely, and said, "Hello, sir. I'm here to visit my father, House 42. Rick didn't respond. He was too absorbed in his fantasy of authority to actually listen. Instead, he shouted, "Step out of the vehicle. I need to see identification." His voice was loud enough to wake the neighbor's dogs and probably half the neighborhood itself. I started shouting from the porch, "Rick, relax, she's my daughter." But he ignored me completely, consumed by his own sense of power. What happened next made my heart stop. Rick, in his delusion of control, reached for his sidearm. It was a moment that could have gone terribly wrong. I froze, not knowing whether to yell, run, or just hope that my daughter could handle this. She didn't flinch. She didn't panic. She simply stayed calm, scanning him and the surrounding area with a level of focus that only came from years of training. I could see her assessing his stance, the angle of his weapon, the distance between them. Every movement calculated, every breath measured. He had no idea what he was dealing with. My daughter was a tactical commander, trained in disarming armed threats and handling life-or-death situations. And yet here she was, smiling faintly, speaking in that calm, steady voice that always worked even in the most dangerous circumstances. She said, "Sir, please lower your weapon. There is no need for this." Rick's confidence didn't waver. He still stood there, gun partially drawn, looking like a man about to prove his dominance. He had clearly convinced himself that he was protecting the neighborhood from some imaginary threat. I wanted to yell at him, to tell him he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life, but my voice got caught in my throat. Emily didn't need my voice. She was completely in control. Her movements were smooth and precise, every decision made with absolute clarity. She positioned herself in a way that gave her the advantage without escalating the situation. She didn't raise her own weapon because she didn't need to. Just her presence and confidence were enough to destabilize Rick. I could almost see the gears turning in his head as he realized, maybe too late, that this wasn't going to end the way he imagined. Then, just as Rick started to hesitate, his walkie-talkie squawked again. He fumbled, distracted, and that was all the opening Emily needed. She moved quickly, disarming him with skill and precision, all without causing harm. He stumbled back, shocked and confused, realizing in that instant that he had misjudged the situation entirely. I ran outside, my heart still hammering. My daughter looked at me, calm as ever, and said, "Don't worry, Dad. He's not going to hurt anyone now." I nodded, still in disbelief at how quickly she had turned the entire situation around. I knew Rick would never look at our neighborhood the same way again, and for the first time, I began to feel a sense of pride mixed with relief. But just as I thought the worst was over, movement at the gate caught my eye. The HOA president, Karen, was walking up the driveway, clipboard in hand, her expression a mix of anger and panic. I could see her lips moving, yelling something, but I couldn't hear over the pounding of my heart. I realized then that whatever calm we had left was about to evaporate entirely. Hook, she was about to arrive, and with her, a new level of chaos that none of us could have predicted. The moment Karen arrived, everything shifted. She stormed toward the gate, her clipboard held like a shield, shouting orders as if she were leading a battalion. Rick, already shaken, straightened up even more, trying to prove he was still in control. I could feel my stomach knotting tighter with every step she took. Something about this weekend had turned our quiet street into a full-blown drama, and I had no idea it was about to escalate even further. My daughter stayed calm, leaning slightly forward in her seat, keeping her hands visible but ready to act. She spoke in a steady voice, "Sir, please lower your weapon. There is no need for this. I'm visiting my father." Rick's eyes darted between Emily and Karen, completely torn between enforcing his imagined authority and responding to this new intrusion. Then it happened. Rick, desperate to assert control, actually unbuckled his sidearm. My heart froze. I wanted to yell, I wanted to run, I wanted to do anything other than watch what was about to unfold. The tension in the air was palpable. Neighbors had started peeking through their windows, unsure whether they should intervene or call 911. My throat went dry. I could barely breathe as Rick's hand hovered over the weapon, his voice cracking slightly with bravado. "Step out of the vehicle." Emily didn't flinch. She didn't scream. She didn't even raise her voice. She simply observed him with an intensity that was unnerving, her tactical training taking over. She had already calculated every angle, his reach, the distance to the gate, the slope of the driveway, even the way the sunlight reflected off his sunglasses. Within seconds, she moved with precision and disarmed him, taking the gun without firing a single shot. Rick stumbled backward, completely stunned. The entire scene felt surreal. One minute, my daughter was casually driving home. The next, she had neutralized a man brandishing a firearm in the middle of our quiet neighborhood. The neighbors were frozen, mouths open, some clutching their phones to record, unsure whether to call the police or just watch. Karen, however, was frozen in a mix of anger and disbelief, still clutching her clipboard as if it might somehow save her from what was happening. I ran toward the gate, my heart racing. My daughter looked up at me calmly and said, "Don't worry, Dad. He's not going to hurt anyone now." Her composure made me realize just how out of place Rick and Karen were in this situation. They were operating under the assumption that they were in control, when in reality, they had no idea what they were dealing with. Rick, still reeling, fumbled on the ground, muttering, I was just doing my job." His confidence had completely crumbled, replaced by a mix of fear and confusion. I could see him questioning every decision he had ever made, every patrol, every imagined threat. My daughter's eyes followed him, making sure he didn't make any sudden moves. She had him contained without lifting a finger in anger or raising her own weapon. It was mesmerizing to watch. Just as I thought the situation might finally calm down, Karen stepped closer, shouting at my daughter, "You assaulted our officer, you're trespassing, this is unacceptable." Emily, unfazed, slowly reached into her bag and pulled out her FBI tactical badge, showing it to both Rick and Karen. The look on Karen's face was priceless, pure shock mixed with panic. She stammered, that can't be real." Rick, meanwhile, slowly started backing away, finally realizing that the weekend he had imagined as a display of control had turned into a personal nightmare. My daughter didn't move, didn't shout, didn't threaten. She simply stood her ground, letting her training speak louder than words. The tension was unbearable, but somehow she made it look effortless. I felt a mix of pride, relief, and lingering terror. My quiet street had become a battleground, but somehow the chaos had been contained before anyone got hurt. And yet, I knew this was far from over. Karen wasn't the type to let things end quietly, and Rick had just learned a lesson he would probably never forget. The real chaos was about to arrive as the police showed up, and Karen realized her authority had just evaporated. The chaos at the gate had just reached a whole new level. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, stormed toward us, her clipboard clutched like a shield, her phone already out to record every second. Her face was red, her voice sharp, and I could tell she thought she was about to take control of the situation. Rick was still trying to collect himself on the ground, muttering about how he had authority and security protocols. But he looked more like a frightened child than the powerful guard he had pretended to be. My daughter, Emily, stayed calm, her eyes following every move. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't flinch. She simply assessed the situation like it was another tactical scenario. She was polite but firm, explaining to Rick that he had no right to brandish a weapon on private property without proper authorization. He stammered, trying to argue back, but the words came out in broken sentences. She was in full control without making a single aggressive move. Karen, of course, had no idea what she was walking into. She started yelling at Emily, insisting that she had assaulted the HOA's security officer. She waved her clipboard in the air like it was evidence, shouting, "You have no right to touch him. This is trespassing. I am calling the board." The sight was almost comical, except for the tension in the air. I wanted to intervene, to tell Karen to calm down, but I knew better. My daughter had this handled. Emily reached calmly into her bag and pulled out her FBI tactical badge. She didn't shout, she didn't threaten, she simply showed it to Karen and Rick. The effect was immediate. Karen froze, her mouth opening and closing as if she were trying to form words, but none would come. Rick's face turned pale, and he started mumbling that this couldn't be real. My daughter's presence alone had completely overturned their confidence. Neighbors had started to gather around, peeking from windows and doorways. Some were filming with their phones, unsure whether to call 911 or just watch. Everyone could see the tension, the power struggle, and the complete breakdown of the HOA authority. For once, the neighborhood was witnessing real consequences for all the over-the-top control measures they had endured for years. I felt a mixture of pride and disbelief as I watched my daughter remain calm while Karen flailed helplessly. She could have escalated, she could have shouted or threatened, but she didn't. Instead, she simply explained in a clear and measured tone that Rick had violated the law by brandishing a weapon and that any further action could have serious legal consequences. Karen's face turned from red to a pale shade of fear. For the first time, she seemed unsure, as if the carefully constructed image of power she had built for years was crumbling right in front of her. Rick finally sat down on the pavement, completely defeated. His walkie-talkie had fallen to the ground and his confidence had evaporated. He looked at Emily, then at me, and muttered, I was just following orders." The absurdity of the situation was almost laughable, except for the fact that a firearm had actually been involved. And then, like a storm breaking, the sound of sirens pierced the tension. The police had arrived, and the moment they stepped out of their vehicles, the entire dynamic changed. The first officer looked directly at Emily and said, "Commander Hayes, ma'am, what's going on here?" Karen's face turned a shade whiter, her clipboard trembling in her hands. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. Emily calmly explained what had happened, Rick pulling a gun, the attempted intimidation, and how she had disarmed him without incident. The officers took control of the situation quickly, assessing Rick, Karen, and the overall scene. Neighbors started whispering excitedly, realizing that what they had witnessed was more than just another suburban argument. This was serious. I stood there, still trying to process everything, watching Karen finally realize that her authority was gone. Her plans for control, for dominance over the neighborhood had collapsed in front of everyone. Rick was in trouble, the officers were in command, and my daughter, calm and composed, had completely flipped the power dynamic. It was surreal, almost like watching a scene from a movie, except it was happening in my front yard. Karen was silent, Rick was defeated, but the real fallout was about to start as the board got involved, and the entire neighborhood braced for what was coming next. The moment the police arrived, the tension shifted again, but this time it was different. Rick was still on the ground, muttering about following orders and security protocols, but he looked more like a scared child than a neighborhood protector. Karen, on the other hand, was trying to regain her composure, waving her clipboard and phone wildly, insisting that the situation was entirely under her control. The officers, however, made it immediately clear that this was no ordinary neighborhood dispute. The first officer stepped forward and looked at my daughter, Emily. "Commander Hayes, ma'am, what's happening here?" She calmly explained the situation, her voice steady, precise, and completely confident. She described Rick pulling a firearm without authority, the threat he posed, and how she had disarmed him without escalating the situation. The officers listened intently, taking notes and making clear that Rick had violated the law. Karen tried to interrupt, shouting, "He was just doing his job. This is trespassing. You can't do this." The officers didn't even flinch. One officer, clearly unimpressed, turned to her and asked, "Ma'am, why did your board hire armed security without proper certification?" Karen opened her mouth, then closed it, realizing she had no answer. She was silent for a long moment, her face pale, as if someone had drained the confidence right out of her. Rick, meanwhile, was being escorted by another officer, still trying to argue that he was justified. The officers were firm but professional, guiding him away from the scene while ensuring that no one was harmed. I couldn't help but notice the irony. Rick had come in thinking he was enforcing authority, and now he was on his way to a real police report, completely powerless. Neighbors started coming out of their homes, watching the scene unfold. Whispers spread quickly. "Did you see what happened? Rick actually pulled a gun? Karen looks like she's about to faint." For the first time, the neighborhood was seeing real consequences for the absurd control measures they had endured for years. Everyone had a front-row seat to karma in action. Karen tried one last desperate attempt, arguing that she could handle this internally and that the board would deal with it. The officer gave her a long, steady look and said, "Ma'am, this is federal interference now. Your security officer brandished a firearm illegally. This is a serious offense." The weight of the words hit her like a sledgehammer. I watched her shoulders slump, her clipboard trembling in her hands, her carefully constructed persona of control crumbling completely. I turned to Emily, who was still standing calm and collected, observing everything. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to threaten anyone. Her presence alone had shifted the entire balance of power. The officers spoke to her respectfully, treating her as a professional, while Karen and Rick were left scrambling to justify themselves. It was surreal to watch, like seeing a neighborhood play being rewritten in real time with unexpected actors. I felt a mix of pride and relief. My daughter had handled an extremely dangerous situation without escalating it, without causing harm, and yet she had completely upended the neighborhood hierarchy. The lessons here were obvious. Overconfidence, arrogance, and lack of proper training were no match for experience, skill, and calm presence of mind. As the officers finished processing Rick and explaining the legal implications, Karen sat down on the curb, defeated. For the first time in years, she was speechless, powerless, and stripped of her imagined authority. The neighborhood had witnessed the collapse of her empire firsthand, and it was mesmerizing to watch the shift in power dynamics. I realized then that this incident was far from over. Karen wouldn't just disappear quietly, and the board would have to deal with federal scrutiny. The ripple effects of Rick's mistake and her arrogance were only beginning. I also knew that, in the coming days, the entire neighborhood would feel the consequences. No one would ever underestimate Emily, or the power of someone who knew exactly how to handle chaos without letting it spiral out of control. The board would soon find out that this was more than a simple incident at the gate, and Karen's attempts to regain control were about to backfire spectacularly. A week after the incident at the gate, the HOA called an emergency board meeting. I knew it was going to be tense, but I had no idea just how chaotic it would become. The community room was packed, neighbors spilling into the hallways, everyone whispering, eyes wide with curiosity and anticipation. Rumors had already spread about what had happened. A security officer pulling a gun on my daughter, and the entire board now facing scrutiny. The air was thick with anticipation, and I could feel my own pulse quicken as we walked in. Karen was at the head of the room, her clipboard clutched so tightly it looked like it might crumble under the pressure. She had been rehearsing her story all week, trying to spin the event to make it sound like my daughter was the aggressor. She began speaking in a loud, commanding voice, painting Rick as a victim who had been assaulted, and insisting that the board would handle the situation internally. But the moment she finished her opening remarks, someone from the audience raised their hand and asked, "Have you seen the bodycam footage?" Silence. Karen's confident posture faltered for the first time that week. She stammered, we're reviewing it internally." At that moment, the tension in the room shifted. Neighbors started whispering, some laughing under their breath, others nodding in disbelief. The footage from the police had already circulated among a few residents, and everyone knew the truth. Rick had pulled the gun first, and my daughter had disarmed him calmly, without escalating the situation. One by one, neighbors began speaking up. "Why was an untrained officer allowed to patrol our neighborhood with a firearm?" Someone else shouted. "Why does the HOA have the power to hire armed guards without proper oversight?" The room erupted in murmurs and questions, and Karen's face went from red to pale. She tried to regain control, waving her clipboard, pointing fingers, but every attempt only fueled the crowd. I watched my daughter sitting quietly beside me, calm as ever. She didn't need to intervene. Her presence alone reminded everyone that the security threat had been neutralized professionally and safely. She had handled a potentially deadly situation, and now the entire community was seeing firsthand the consequences of arrogance, incompetence, and overreach. Rick's mistake was laid bare, and Karen's failure to manage the board became painfully obvious. One board member even stood up and said, "We need to rethink the entire security system. Armed guards with no oversight are dangerous." The crowd cheered, and Karen tried to speak, but her voice was drowned out by the growing chorus of complaints and concerns. She waved her clipboard, muttering about procedures, but no one was listening anymore. The meeting spiraled further into chaos. Neighbors demanded resignations, questioned authority, and criticized the board for negligence. Karen tried to shout over them, trying to assert control, but the more she spoke, the more she undermined herself. She had built her entire identity around control, power, and the illusion of authority, and now all of it was crumbling in front of dozens of witnesses. I could barely contain my own emotions, a mix of pride in my daughter and disbelief at how quickly things had turned. The neighborhood had finally seen justice in action, and Karen's carefully maintained persona was evaporating before our eyes. Every frustrated shout, every pointed question, every neighbor demanding accountability was a reminder that arrogance and abuse of power have consequences. By the end of the night, 3 board members had resigned, unable to face the scrutiny and backlash. Karen sat slumped in her chair, clutching her clipboard, muttering under her breath. She was powerless, speechless, and completely exposed. The meeting adjourned with a sense of relief sweeping through the room. The neighborhood had taken back some measure of control, and Rick's actions were now a cautionary tale for everyone. I looked at my daughter and smiled. She had handled the situation without aggression, without escalation, and yet her presence had completely dismantled the authority structure that had been abusing its power. It was a masterclass in calm, measured intervention, and the entire neighborhood had just witnessed it firsthand. Karen thought she had survived the board meeting, but the next surprise, a federal letter was about to seal her fate, and there would be no way to spin it this time. Just when we thought the chaos had settled after the board meeting, the next shock arrived in the mail. It was a certified letter, the kind that makes your heart skip a beat before you even open it. It wasn't addressed to me, it was for the HOA board. I grabbed it, feeling a mix of curiosity and dread, and slowly tore open the envelope. Inside was a letter from the Department of Justice. My eyes widened as I read the first lines. The letter stated that the board was under federal investigation for misuse of authority, armed intimidation, and interference with a federal officer. Every detail of the gate incident had been documented, including Rick pulling a firearm without proper authorization and the resulting threats to public safety. The complaint had been officially filed by my daughter. I could hardly believe it. She had stayed calm, neutralized the situation professionally, and now the consequences were fully official. The letter outlined that all board members could be called in for questioning, and that the HOA could face serious legal consequences if corrective measures were not taken immediately. It was the kind of notice that made even the most confident person shake in their boots. Karen called me before I even had a chance to read the letter fully. Her voice was frantic, bordering on hysterical. "Please, you have to make this go away," she begged. "I don't understand how this happened. I can fix it. We can negotiate." I listened quietly, letting her panic fill the line. There was no way I was going to rescue her from the mess she had created. She had underestimated my daughter, overestimated her own control, and now it was all unraveling. I finally spoke, calm but firm. "Karen, you pulled a gun on the wrong house. This isn't something you can negotiate away. You made your choices, and now you're facing the consequences." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled with disbelief and desperation. She sputtered, trying to come up with another argument, but I had already hung up. There was nothing left to say. The letter didn't just threaten Karen, it sent shockwaves through the entire board. Suddenly, their attempts to control the narrative, to spin the story, and to maintain their authority were meaningless. The legal weight of the federal investigation made their power play completely irrelevant. Neighbors whispered excitedly, some laughing quietly, others shaking their heads at the absurdity of it all. It was like watching karma unfold in real time. I looked at my daughter, who was sitting calmly beside me, scrolling through her phone. She didn't celebrate, she didn't gloat. She simply remained composed, her presence alone a reminder of why this situation had escalated to this point. The letter had cemented the truth. Rick had overstepped, Karen had failed, and my daughter had handled the entire ordeal without ever breaking a sweat. Over the next few days, the neighborhood changed. Karen tried to rally support, calling board members and neighbors, insisting they could handle it internally. But everyone knew the letter had shifted the balance. The federal investigation meant the board could no longer act with impunity. It was a quiet but undeniable victory, one that left the community feeling a mix of relief and vindication. I could see Karen packing in her office, muttering to herself, trying to think of ways to undo the damage. Every strategy she considered crumbled under the reality of the federal investigation. Her authority was gone, her confidence shattered, and her reputation in the neighborhood was in tatters. I knew then that there was no turning back. The quiet satisfaction of knowing justice was coming, combined with the anticipation of watching the final fallout, was almost intoxicating. The neighborhood had endured years of petty rules, overreach, and ridiculous control, and finally they were witnessing accountability in action. And the best part, it was all handled by my daughter calmly and professionally without ever needing to raise her voice or fire a shot. Karen thought she had one last chance to regain control, but the final chapter was about to close in the most satisfying way, and the neighborhood would witness her ultimate downfall. 2 weeks after the federal letter arrived, the neighborhood felt almost eerily quiet. There was a tension in the air, a mix of relief and anticipation, because everyone knew Karen's authority had crumbled, but no one yet knew exactly how far the consequences would reach. The board had already started to fold under the weight of the investigation, and Rick had been suspended pending further review. It was only a matter of time before the final chapter played out. The day Karen moved out was surreal. I watched from my porch as moving trucks arrived, neighbors peeking curiously from behind curtains and fences. Her car, perfectly polished despite the chaos she had caused, rolled down the street for the last time. She had muttered something about rebuilding her reputation, but no one believed her. The aura of power she had carried for years had completely vanished. Federal investigators arrived later that week to collect evidence. They asked for documents, security contracts, and even video footage from the gate incident. Rick's illegal security contracts were confiscated, and the board was formally reprimanded. The investigators were professional, precise, and utterly uncompromising. It was clear that the neighborhood's problems had finally caught the attention of the right authorities, and this time there would be no excuses or spin. Neighbors slowly began to relax, emerging from their homes, talking in hushed tones about the drama that had unfolded. Some admitted that they had feared Karen's wrath for years, afraid to speak up about petty rules and unreasonable demands. Now they felt vindicated. They realized that the chaos and overreach they had endured for so long were finally being addressed. For once, the neighborhood felt safe not because of armed security, but because the people in charge were finally being held accountable. Emily, as calm and collected as ever, visited me that weekend. She laughed quietly as we watched the last of Karen's possessions being loaded into the truck. "I guess she won't be enforcing neighborhood rules anytime soon," she said, smirking. I couldn't help but laugh too, thinking about how efficiently she had handled the entire situation without escalating it or causing harm. Rick, on the other hand, had found a new job at a mall security desk. Unarmed this time, thankfully. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The man who had once thought he could intimidate my daughter with a gun was now patrolling a food court, managing lost umbrellas and spilled drinks. Karma, it seemed, had a way of correcting itself in the most fitting manner. The board eventually restructured, stripping unnecessary powers and removing the idea of armed security entirely. Volunteers stepped forward to manage community concerns, focusing on fairness rather than control. The neighborhood began to breathe again, free from the suffocating oversight that had ruled for years. The lesson was clear. Arrogance and abuse of authority do not go unpunished, especially when confronted with skill, calm, and integrity. I watched my daughter pack up her things to return to her FBI duties. She smiled at me, that same quiet confidence that had saved the day, and said, "Dad, sometimes the best way to handle chaos is to stay calm and do your job." She didn't need to explain anything more. The neighborhood, the board, and even Karen had already learned that lesson the hard way. As I walked back to the porch, watching the sun set over the quiet street, I realized something important. The neighborhood wasn't just safe because the authorities were finally involved. It was safe because one person, trained, capable, and calm under pressure, had stood her ground. She had neutralized a threat, ensured justice, and allowed the community to reclaim its peace. For years, we had tolerated petty rules, overreach, and intimidation. Now we had clarity, justice, and the knowledge that no one could bully this neighborhood into fear again. My daughter had handled everything without raising her voice, without escalating violence, and yet her actions had left a mark that would be remembered for years. It was a quiet, satisfying victory, and one that left the neighborhood forever changed. Hook, the quiet returned, the chaos faded, and for the first time in years, our neighborhood knew that true authority wasn't about power or intimidation. It was about calm, skill, and doing the right thing. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.